You're not looking for revenue. You're not looking for growth. You're damn sure not looking for profit. What you're looking for is learning. And how quickly can you learn is the metric you're optimizing around.
Welcome to Not Another CEO podcast. I'm your host, David Politis. Every week, we talk to inspiring leaders and get the true stories, the ups and downs, the lessons learned, and come away with actionable advice for our own journeys. Today's guest is a multi-time founder who has dedicated the last 13 years of his career to revolutionizing the way companies discover and hire top talent. He is one of the few entrepreneurs who was building technology companies in New York City 20 plus years ago. Those were definitely the early days. And his current business is one of the most successful SaaS companies to come out of New York. They've helped thousands of companies improve all aspects of hiring, helping them attract top talent and elevating recruiting to be a strategic business driver. If you've been involved on either side of a hiring process, there is a very high likelihood you've interacted with their software. Please welcome Daniel Chait, co-founder and CEO of Greenhouse.
Hey, David, good to see you. Nice to be here.
Great to see you. Thank you for doing this. First question, we'll jump right in. What is the one thing you've done at Greenhouse, big or small, that's had the biggest impact and you'll absolutely do again if you're CEO of another company in the future?
Great question right off the top. I think, I go all the way back to the beginning. And I would say that more than anything else, the way that we approached coming up with our company's mission, more than anything, has had lasting impact on the business. And I say that because, at the time, it wasn't really obvious what a company like ours ought to be doing. In fact, most companies that were in the kind of hiring and recruiting software saw recruiting and hiring as administrative in nature, as something that involved kind of paperwork tracking and compliance. And that was reflected in a lot of the tools at the time when we started. Everybody that was selling recruiting stuff said stuff like, your hiring software is complicated, hiring's a pain in the butt, nobody wants to do it, we're going to make it really simple, we're going to get all the hassle off your plate so you can focus on what matters. And we basically saw that as the wrong approach. We said, no. There's a major, significant strategic imperative that companies have now, which is to be great at hiring. And nobody's helping them do that. And so we took a lot of time, probably more time than most. I think a lot of startups say, hey, let's get into it. Let's start building. But we really stepped back. I credit my co-founder with a lot of this, by the way. He came with a great product background and said, let's really clarify who we're selling to, what their problems are, how we're going to do it, how we're going to do it differently. And I think the time that we invested up front to clarify the mission and our approach, as I say, has been paying off dividends for now, as you say, 13 years plus.
And so when you think about that, was that in a written form? Was that over a course of, 100 hours, 2 weeks? Like how did you go about doing that?
To paraphrase a famous saying, it was gradually and then all at once. So we struggled for the better part of a year to figure out what we wanted to do and churn through dozens and dozens of different business ideas and really didn't hit on anything we believed in. And then kind of all at once, we had this aha moment where, we kind of looked at each other. We thought, well, what do we really know? And we talked to each about our journeys in hiring and the things we had learned and the things we had seen that work really well and the struggles we had seen at so many other organizations that weren't doing those things. And it all came kind of barreling out at once. Like, there's this huge opportunity. The way to do it is really clear. Nobody's doing it really well. We think we can deliver this thing. And we spent like a couple of weeks just like almost like getting it out of our heads. Like the idea kind of emerged fully formed. All we had to do was write it down. And we wrote this kind of business plan, sort of manifesto of what we wanted to do and kind of a PowerPoint, the deck of how we were going to do it, including things like changes that we thought we wanted to see happen in the industry or that we thought would happen in the industry if we were right. And I got to say, like, we really were on that roadmap for, over 10 years, where John and I would go back to this kind of document we had written in 2011 in November before we even incorporated. And it was like, right. So here's how this is playing out and here's what's going to happen next. And here's what we're trying to do. So it was one of those moments of kind of where creativity kind of like you've been steeped in it so long and then it all clicks kind of all at one time.
And where Where did customers, like, how much time did you spend validating this with potential customers?
So, as soon as it came into our heads and got written down, then we began the process of, well, let's validate it. And as I say, a lot of, I think, startups, they just start blasting out code because code is cheap to write these days. In fact, now it's cheaper than it was even then. And then it was cheaper than when I started my first company. So, it was an easy thing to do because no one's going to stop you. You can just start writing code. But we didn't do that. We said, well, what are the kind of unknowns? What are the things that we need to prove to ourselves, before we can scale this business? I always think that if you're going to be a venture-backed SaaS business, fundamentally the job, I like to say it as, is you want to create a capital constrained growth engine. What I mean is you want to get to the point where the only thing you need is money and then you can produce lots of growth. Well, we weren't there yet. We were two guys with an idea. And so I was like, what do we need to know? Well, we need to know things like, are we right about the theory of like what companies actually care about and how we think they can get better through this methodology? Do we know like who buys this thing and what they're willing to pay for it and what their alternatives are? And on and on. And we just kind of like lined up what are those questions, each one of which we figured out how we would answer and get us closer and closer to that idea of a capital constrained growth engine. Because once you have that, selling that to an investor is really easy. We could raise money on. And so, I mean, the first thing we did, we literally on index cards went to a friend of mine who worked at a big company, and she was building out at that time a team of iOS engineers. I said, "Hey, can I run an idea by you?" She said, "Absolutely." So we went to her office, literally a stack of index cards and a pen, and we said, "Okay, we're going to talk to you about a hire that you're making right now and ask you some questions, and you can answer them." She said, "Okay." And we started the timer. We said, "So like, tell me about the type of hire you're making." She said, "Okay, I'm like hiring an iOS engineer. What are the skills you need for that job?" And she started listing them off, and everyone we would write an index card, put on the desk. She named 6 or 7. And then we said, "Okay, so for each of those skills, like how will you know if the person has it? Like, what are you going to do to test for that skill?" "Well, I need someone that can program in Objective-C. I need someone that can manage projects and deadlines, and that's going to be creative," and so on and so forth. And each of them, she spent a minute and thought about an interview, and okay, this is how I'm going to test for it. And we said, "Okay, who in your team is going to deliver each of those assessments?" And blah, blah, blah. And then lastly, kind of where are you going to find people like that? What are some places where people like that are going to be that you're going to go get them? And each of those, again, we write an index card. And at the end of it, we stopped and we stopped the timer. We said, "So what do you think?" And she looked at the desk at the rows and columns of index cards, and she looked up and she said, "Can I keep this?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "That is the most impactful, effective hiring plan I've ever seen in my life. I want to use it." We're like, "Oh, we're onto something." And we looked at the stopwatch and it was like 10 minutes. So in 10 minutes time with zero technology, someone just through the right set of prompts and thinking could get to a place where they saw a revolution in how they themselves were able to approach hiring. This is someone at a big successful company. We were in a high skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. And so we thought, okay, maybe we're onto something. The next thing we did was we went to a General Assembly, which at the time was kind of a startup university. I don't know what you call it, startup school. Yeah. And they would take people in who wanted to build startups and they would say, "Okay, everything you need to know, we can teach you," like a boot camp, whether it's like JavaScript programming, web design, search engine optimization, like all the stuff you need to know to build and grow a startup. And we said, "Hey, like, I think hiring is really important in growing a business, and you don't have a class in that. Can we teach this class?" And they said, "Absolutely." And so they took care of like marketing the class, bringing students. They had the physical room, like classroom, and all we had to do was show up and deliver the class. And so day one, we got there and it was like a Tuesday after work and they filled up the room. There's like 30 people. And I sat at the front of the room and my co-founder sat in the back with a clipboard taking notes. And I basically talked about what we thought of at the time as like kind of the greenhouse methodology of structured hiring. Here's how you do it. Here's what a scorecard is. Here's what an interview plan is. And we didn't, again, this was just the same thing as index cards in lecture form. And again, like if we left that and it didn't land, then we had to go back to the drawing board. Like if people didn't get it, like how do we talk about these things? We worked out a lot of the terminology. I mean, the word like scorecard or interview kit, like those are things we had to workshop through these things. Like, do people actually get it? But David, stuff started happening. People would email me the next day and they would say, "Yo, I took your class at GA last night. I had a meeting. I called a meeting of my team the next morning and threw out our playbook on hiring and rewrote it according to your class." Like, this is incredible. And time and again, people would do that. And so a lot of our early customers actually came out of that class because they connected with what we were saying. And so when we had a product that could do it, I could go back to them and say, hey, that methodology we talked about, now we have some software to automate it. But it helped answer, again, some of these fundamental questions of like, are we saying something is going to land? Companies actually going to be able to do this stuff? Are we right about the theory? And on and on. And so we did things to figure out like the business model and all the
I
rest.
love it. I love it. That General Assembly one that's a good story. I love it because I think when I've talked to people, because this wasn't the first company that you
Was my
founded,
third.
right? This was the third company. And so when I talk to multi-time founders, the amount of time that they spend doing this is all the time. I mean, basically, when I talk to multi-time founders, they're like, I met with 70 potential customers. The General Assembly was a great one. I went and did this thing at I love that. And I think I am of the opinion, it is this thing where you feel like you just want to go and you want to build and you want to everything. It's like, that's the natural tendency, but actually taking all of that time lets you go faster once you go actually start building, right?
You have so much of a richer data set of kind of stories to pull from when you're talking to that prospect or that investor and they're asking you a question. You'd be like, you know what? I was talking to the head of recruiting last week at so-and-so, and here's what they're going through. Like, it's so much more credible, and it's so cheap to make mistakes. Like, making mistakes in software is expensive. Even now, to address that in the market, it takes time and it's costly, and to do it in pen and paper and is so inexpensive that you can learn so quickly. And, we thought a lot about the lean startup methodology, which had recently come out at the time. And I thought the key insight from that we tried to apply was this idea that you really need to think about your business in kind of two distinct phases. The first phase where you really don't have product market fit, and after. And in that first phase, all the things you think about in the later phases don't apply as metrics of success. You're not looking for revenue. You're not looking for growth. You're damn sure not looking for profit. What you're looking for is learning. And how quickly can you learn is the metric you're optimizing around. And so that's all we were thinking about, was like, what are the questions we're having, or you could say the risks in the business, the unknowns, and then how quickly can we barrel through them and get to knowns. Once we had that, then again, like I say, then you're like, okay, now it's just a matter of execution and growth, and we need capital and we need people, but you're following a playbook that you've got a ton of belief in and evidence behind.
One of the things, obviously you're an expert in hiring at this point. What is it that you look for when you're hiring someone for your team?
Well, I'm kind of zen about the whole idea of an expert in hiring. I feel like, if you feel like you're an expert in hiring, you probably don't know enough yet. I feel like, the more you learn, the more you realize like it's really hard and there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of nuance to it. And so I always start there as like, this is not an exact science. But having said that, I think the goal of a great hiring process is to improve the odds, is to make it more likely that you'll hire the best person, every time, and that you can learn and adapt, and continuous improvement is the name of the game. For me, I think maybe relevant to your question, a little bit of context around the business itself, because the answer to your question changes with what's happening in business. So I would say when we started, we were looking for, one of the kind of key things that we looked for in leaders was the, smart and gets things done. Like, and you can figure things out, like problem solving, entrepreneurialism, because everything we were doing was new and growth, and whatever problems we were solving today, by the time I hire and onboard you, I got new problems. And so it was more about like that adaptability. And I think that served us really well for a long, long time. Now I'm sitting here, early 2025, over $200 million in revenue, thousands and thousands of customers, many hundreds of employees across the world. Is different. And what's interesting about Greenhouse now is we both have a big existing business, as I just kind of categorized for you, and there's a huge amount of growth and new things that we're trying to push on at the same time. So the thing I'm looking for a leader now is that like kind of high dynamic range, that idea that you can operate at the strategic level, you can think big picture, you can think long term, you can communicate at scale, and we don't have corner offices here. You got to like get your hands on the business and like make a spreadsheet and send an email and talk to a customer. You can't be too good for those jobs, because you still got to get stuff done. You still got to be interested in building and growing, and learning. And so it's a different mixture. It's a different profile. And certainly if we talk again in another 10 years, it'll be different again.
Do you have a go-to question that you ask in the interview process?
I mean, again, I kind of reject the notion of that. Like it's not, there's no magical questions like, oh, everyone's going to write this down. Oh, I'm going to ask all that. Everyone should ask this one question. That's like great for like a BuzzFeed listicle, but it doesn't really work. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut. Like you got to think really carefully about what you need. And then you gotta focus your limited time with interviewing someone on those important needs. And so it really depends on what you need in that role and what you're looking for.
And so how do you determine, like how much time do you spend right now with a candidate? How much time are you spending with them in an interview process?
I will spend ultimately probably 8 hours with an exec that we hire. So I'll do a 1-hour screen off the bat, near the top of the funnel. Then they'll go through a battery of interviews with some other folks on my team. And then as I get later into the process, they'll come back in. I'll usually do like a 90-minute or so working session with them because I want to understand more deeply how they think, and how we communicate. And so we'll spend some time in kind of a scenario doing work together. And then we'll spend a little bit more unstructured time together. Usually it's like some back and forth Q&A. They want to know about me. We want to know about them. Maybe we'll have a meal together. And so that's another few hours time.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think about, you mentioned this to me when we were preparing for this, is like the number of hours you may work with someone is thousands, right? I mean,
what is there, 2,100 work hours in a typical work year or something to that effect, right? So if you're going to hire an exec and you're giving them a 4-year vest, that's 8,000 some hours that they're going to be here. So if you're going to spend 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever it takes to get the job right, do it, because the cost of getting it wrong is enormous, and the opportunity of getting it right is enormous. And so the investment in time for hiring someone like that is tremendous. Now, I should say, not every job is like that. Most people aren't running around hiring C-level executives out of SaaS business. And so, you have to be smart about what's the right investment, what's the right trade-off. In fact, I was talking to a customer, I was talking to a customer just last month, and he said, because we were honed in on, they had in their case a certain percentage of their hires that I was categorizing as failures. That, in other words, you hired a person and within 6 months, the person was no longer at the business. And I thought, kind of every time that happens, it's a failure. And he said to me, it's interesting. He said, for a lot of our roles, that's very true. But some roles, he's like, I really want to experiment. I really want to try a bunch of different things out. I don't know what's going to work yet. I think there's probably something better than what we've tried before. So I want to put a bunch of irons in the fire. And if most of them don't work out, but one of them is a home run, it's all worth it. So it's almost like a little bit of a portfolio approach where he thought, if I don't make a couple failed hires, I may not be taking enough risk. And so that may also, like, that may not be you, like it's different by role, but like I say, unfortunately, there's no substitute for thinking, like is quite nuanced. But yes, if you're hiring a job that you've done a lot before and is kind of routine. So I think of like most SaaS businesses, they hire a lot of salespeople, they hire a lot of programmers, they hire a lot of customer support people. If I think about a e-commerce business, they hire a lot of, pick and pack warehouse people. They hire a lot of customer support, customer service, reps. They've hired hundreds of these over and over and over again. Like you can get it down to a real science, and you can do it. You can measure it statistically, and you can shrink the interview funnel to like just a bare minimum, so you can work really fast. Like those are the kind of optimizations you can do when you make the same hire over and over and over again. But if you're hiring an executive at a firm, the optimization is just get the hire right no matter what.
What's interesting, with a lot of companies that I work with these days, I'm realizing the repeatability in like the sales motion or the engineer or these things that you're talking about. I agree with that 100%. If they then have the ability to performance manage those people, right? Because if not, you can end up with, if you don't have the machine on the back end, you end up hiring a bunch of these people because you feel like, oh, we've done it 100 times, but you don't have that performance management machinery to ensure that only the best people stay.
Yeah, well, when you say performance manage as a verb, it's a euphemism for firing, right?
Yeah. Well, true. Yes.
Well, so I think there's a few things in there, because I think you're right. You got to be able to identify who's succeeding in the job. clarify what that even means for the people who are trying to do it. Arm your managers with the opportunity, with the tools that they need to give their teams the opportunity to grow and to succeed. And then, to identify people that's not working out for, and move quickly to fix the problem one way or another. Absolutely. And I think what I've found is that great hiring is actually an incredibly powerful management tool. Why do I say that? The underlying reason why so many managers fail to move on from mediocre performers. Nobody fails to move on from terrible performers, right? If someone's just a tragedy, like, everybody can get rid of them. And, the top performers always do well. But like that middle bucket where you're not quite sure and they're fine, but like, I don't know. The reason managers don't move on from those people often is because they don't know what else. Like, or if I get rid of this person, I got no one. Alternatively, if you just imagine that manager had 100% certainty that they could instantaneously fill that seat with a top performer every single time. Just imagine. I like to picture, let's imagine that sitting behind you right now is a top performer. And at any moment I can say, David, get up, walk away. That top performer is going to sit down in your seat instead, right? Not realistic, but just as a thought exercise, like, well, you'd be on your best behavior. You'd perform better. And as a manager, it would be so easy for me to know, like, if you're not the top performer, I can swap you out for one real less.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
If you picture, I don't always like to use sports analogies in business because they don't always land, but just like, go with me for a second. If you picture an NBA basketball team has like a dozen or 15 people or whatever it is on the bench, right? That's it. And every year there's a college draft and they're allowed to pick like 3 or 4 more people, right? So now they have 19 and they got to get it back down to 15. So they take the 15 best and there's no room for B players. That's it. It's just like they rank them and they just keep who they can and everywhere it goes. And every year there's new amazing talent that can come in that's younger and faster and, all the rest. And, those people, they do a really good job of making sure that they only keep the best talent. And so, that idea of having great hiring behind you as a manager, it really supports the idea that you then also really effectively focused on performance.
That is probably the biggest fear of managers is, I will let this person go. And then who's going to do their job?
Yeah. And you're going, well, gosh, my recruiting team is it's like inconsistent and like doesn't always work. It takes forever, like blah, blah, blah. Well, if you don't have that problem, if you're like, no, I guarantee you that every time I open a role, I'm going to hire a great person. Right. Okay. So you have a great person already? Great. You don't? Why not? Make one.
Wow. So you talk about, the company has scaled, tremendously, obviously, over these years. And how has your job changed over that period of time?
In almost every way. Right? Because when you're getting started, there's only so many people in the room. I mean, we hired 2 programmers and a part-time designer and, built a product and got out to market. Versus now, as I say, I'm leading a company of, 700 and some people. And so it's a lot of leading through others, and a lot of communication. I like to say that, my job is CRO, which is Chief Reputation Officer. You got to say the same things over and over again. You got to focus people on like the few priorities that matter. So I started my career as a programmer. I have an engineering degree. And I remember when I was getting started, I remember hearing CEOs talk about this thing of like, oh, when you get to be a scaled leader, your job is to set the culture and the vision and to lay out the priorities and to communicate. And I'm thinking like, bull crap. Like, you're just saying that because you can't do anything because you're like, it's like, you don't have any useful skills. And now that, of course, I'm in that same seat, I'm like, oh, it is definitely a skill. I'm far from perfect at it. It takes a huge amount of effort to get right. It has a lot of impact. And at the same time, like I said earlier, I don't have a corner office either. And so, I spend a ton of time talking to customers, talking to employees all over the organization, looking at details and numbers, looking at our product, reviewing designs, sitting in business reviews, looking at our sales funnels, like all the stuff. And it's not that I'm smarter than anyone else, in the company. but I do have the broadest purview. I do ultimately have the opportunity to be curious about any part of the business. And
Mm.
so, I take that really seriously too. And I try to get down into the business as much as possible. It's very easy to float above it and sort of stay disconnected. And I worry about that.
I think that balance, what I have seen talking to people at your stage and even my own experience is there, you start so in the weeds and then you kind of get pushed to swing the pendulum to be that chief repetition officer and all of that. And then you realize actually there is a balance there where you can add a lot of value in the weeds still, but you can't really take any initiative to you can't like do an initiative all by yourself because the company gets to a place where you can't you almost will break the machine if you
You
right.
got to be really careful. I've said before, the analogy is like, I'm like a bazooka. Like, it's a really powerful tool, right? But it's not the right tool for every job. And, if you're trying to perform, inner ear surgery with a bazooka, you're going to really make some big problems. But there's some problems that only a bazooka can solve. So in some ways, being the CEO is that. And I think you're right. Like, look, I don't write a single line of code. I don't solve a single customer support issue, or do any of the other innumerable things that our company does. And so, but I do get involved in lots of those things. And so I think about, um, there's a lot of ways to be a leader. I don't have a monopoly on it, but for me, what I always think about is like when I pop into someone's field of view out of nowhere, how do I be effective? And recognizing there's like tremendous power imbalance. There may not be a whole lot of familiarity there. Um, it may sometimes be like they all know me. They see me all the time. Like, I mean, I know this person's name or who they work for or whatever. But yet we got to get something done, kind of quickly together. And so how do I set the context? How do I set the culture? How do I make it safe that those things can happen? And so you have to be really thoughtful or mindful about the weight of your words and how you show up in those conversations.
The weight of your words, I think that that's so important even if at a smaller company, founders, especially the ones that have low ego, you think to yourself, like, what's important about me? Yeah, I'm the founder, but like, I'm just a regular person, I'm just, you know, but when you speak, people take it as gospel. They take it as this is, and I used to have people tell me, my head of people used to tell me, she's like, Dave, you're sitting at the lunch table in the office talking about something. You just kicked off 100 work streams you didn't even appreciate that you kicked off because you were just having a conversation about an idea that you had, and I said, wow, I was literally just having a conversation at lunch thinking, not thinking anything, frankly. And then that happens. And the weight of your words, when you understand actually the weight, you can use that though also to the advantage, right?
You got it. It's just you're not a run of the mill employee, and I bristle. Sometimes you hear people say, "Oh, we're all family here," or "Hey, like I'm just a no, you're not just a normal employee. No, we're not a family. It's a business, and you're the boss. Like, live with that, and then work with that. Use that to your point. Use that in ways that are going to help and be effective. I was in a meeting with all of our customer facing teams. We had an offsite earlier this month, and we were doing a bunch of training and a bunch of skills development. And as part of that, we did some role playing. Now, role playing is already hard. Everyone hates role playing because it's hard, and you're awkward, and you screw it up a bunch of times. And the whole point is you practice, you make your mistakes on the practice field, so that way you can execute when it's for real. And so it's gonna be awkward, and your people are gonna get it wrong. And I'm sitting there in these role plays, and to your point, going from table to table. When I show up at the table, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like Daniel's here, like this is like they're sweating, and they're like, I'm like, hey, so you just gotta recognize it. And for me, I've found an approach of just naming it and being like, hey, look, this is gonna be awkward, and the things I just said to you, like, just make sure to say out loud because they don't know what you're thinking. Be like, listen, the whole point here is to get all the bad reps out of the way on the practice field. So like, make your mistakes right now. That's what we're here for. And if you're making mistakes now, every one of those is one step closer to doing it really well later. And then you start to think about the balance of like, praise to criticism and again, like that weight of your words, like you might say something in a way that is heard very differently than you intended, unless you're super careful. And you can really throw someone off and you end up creating risks and you end up creating problems in your business. And so, I mean, obviously you want to try to be nice and you want to try to be supportive in general as a human being, but from a business standpoint also, like you got to recognize you can really scramble the eggs unless you tread carefully.
I think that one last thing there is, I think one of the things I tell people, I just wrote about this recently on LinkedIn about how important company meetings are, all hands, and I think that's the opportunity to use the repetition, the weight of your words. But again, a lesson I had is I would say stuff that wasn't necessarily run by the rest. Like I didn't share it with the rest of the leadership team. And they'd be like, Dave, now you said that. Now I'm going to have all my people coming to me asking this. And we started doing a lot more preparation before the all hands as the company got bigger so that the leadership team could all see the all hands. They could ask their questions. I don't know. Does that resonate? Like, does that?
Yes. I've been trying to find the right balance there. I mean, for sure, what we did, I mean, you asked about how things have changed. So one thing is like when we were little, we did these, AMA, right? Ask me anything.
Yeah.
And it was great. Like I would stand up, we were 30, 40, 50 people. I would stand up in front of the room, be like, okay, AMA, what's on your mind? And people would raise their hand and shout out a question. I would shout out an answer. It was great. It was authentic. People asked the questions that were on their minds. It was like super efficient way to get information to people. And then at some point we got to like 75, 100, 125 people and the same event design, let's call it, had the opposite effect. And it was like, you're unprepared, you're kind of rambling, you got some stuff wrong, you took some of your leaders by surprise, all the things you said, right? It's like, wait a second, I'm doing the same thing, but because the context has changed, the impact has changed. And so we had to re-engineer it. And to your point, we need to review the questions ahead of time. I don't have all the answers anymore. I don't have the whole business in my head anymore. You want to know about a certain HR policy, like I talk to the HR team. You want to know when a certain feature is shipping, I got to talk to the product team. And so we did a little bit more prep and that helped it, kept things on the rails. We've been iterating on these for years. I think we got to a point last year where I'm like, these are actually feeling a little over-prepared. And we're avoiding those type of mistakes you talked about. I'm not saying the wrong thing. I'm not stepping in front of someone who's going to be taken by surprise. But people aren't getting the real me in a sense. It's too watered down. And so one thing, we've tried a couple things recently that I think have had good impact. One is like, let's just make sure that of the things I'm saying, to the entire company or to most of the company, some of them are riskier or you need to be more careful than others. And so in those cases, yeah, you can write out the whole script. If people want to know anything about pay, anything about benefits, anything about that is affecting like that stuff, don't wing it. Read it. On the other hand, if people want to know about vision, they want to know about strategy, they want to know about policy, even difficult things, they want to know how we're tackling certain problems with the company or in the culture or with competitors, we can prepare ahead of time. Let's get our key points out, but let's write some bullet points and then I can talk to them. And so it's just a little bit less one size fits all. And then, you can be a little bit more. And then the other thing is like, let's recapture some of those smaller groups. And so I don't just have to talk to the whole company. I can go to department meetings. I can go to team meetings and I can get in that room that I talked about with 20 or 30 people and people can raise their hand and I can field questions on the fly. And that works really well too. So you just have to continue adapting to the change and just think about what's good that's getting left behind. How do we recapture that? And what new problems are we happening? How do we iron them out?
So through the years, you've raised a number of rounds of financing. And the last one was with TPG. I think 21 was when you did that deal. When you think about the investors that you've kind of brought around the table over the years, let's start early stage. Like early stage, when you were raising those first rounds of financing, what were you looking for in those investors?
I mean, the money. Like this is like, well, I say that. I mean, I'm not trying to be clever. Like, you hear this a lot of like, oh, like, what do you look for in an investor? What's important? I'm like, I got news for you. And people don't like to say this in their TechCrunch article. They want to sound important, but it's like most of the time you don't have any choices. If you get your one term sheet and somebody that'll write you a check, you take it. And like for most businesses that are trying to raise money, that's the answer. And that was the answer for us for a long time. It was very infrequently. Not that it never happened to us. There was a moment where we had some opportunities, but like generally speaking, the rounds that we raised, we had one investor. And so what I was looking for was like, where's the money? And, sign the paperwork. Having said that, and I can tell some of those stories of like what it was like. And I think it's important too, because I think, people kind of look at, you talked about some of the success that we've had is like, oh, it must have been a certain way. Like, well, no, like it's a struggle for everyone. So I'm happy to talk about some of those too. But I guess, to your question, I do feel that we've been really fortunate in the investors that we've brought in. I think they have all been incredibly value additive and important to say, not destructive. Because I've heard tons of horror stories and seen a lot of stuff secondhand that would, curl your toes about the behavior sometimes of investors and boards with regards to the companies that they invest in. And I just feel really fortunate that we've had supportive, smart, helpful, partnership oriented investors from the very beginning until now with TBG.
So let's talk about those the early rounds. How many people you think you pitched, like, let's say first round of real institutional money? How many people did you pitch before you got the yes?
60?
Wow.
I don't know, all of them. Like it gives, the struggle at first was even before institutional, was just getting our seed capital together. We were trying to get $500,000 to hire those 2 programmers and build, kind of V1. And not exaggerating, we failed. We literally just couldn't do it. And it wasn't until my co-founder and I decided that we had to commit our own money to get things actually started. And we were fortunate enough that we could do that. So we had a few bucks saved away. So we put in the first check. And after that, we were able to catalyze the rest of the round and bring in that, few $100,000 before any institutional money just to get, the V1, even built. And I only say that to say, it's again, like there's a whole industry out there making it look glamorous. And there's a lot of selection bias to the people who've been through it successfully that turn around and talk about what a great idea they had and how many investors and how oversubscribed they were. And that's just not reality. It's just not, any more than, you watch a sitcom and you think that that's like a documentary about a family. Like it's not. It's a story. And so, I just like to be real with people. Like it was a struggle and we really failed. Now another thing we did, I think, well, through that struggle, through that period was we thought at the time we were raising that seed round. Again, the goal when you're venture backed, there's no such thing as one round of venture capital. If you're raising venture capital, you're going to continue raising venture capital, maybe forever, but certainly for a long, long time. And so you always have to think like, there's that phrase like, are you default alive or default dead? And at the beginning, revenue, you're default dead. You raise the money. If nothing changes, you're going to spend it all and go to business. So how do you get to that next round? That was our thing. How do we get to our Series A? And we wrote the story right then. In other words, as soon as we had that seed capital in, it was like, how am I going to raise a Series A? What are the things that they're going to want to see me having done in order to write the check into my Series A? Is it a certain amount of revenue? Is it a certain amount of customers? Do I have to have shipped a product? Like, what are the things that they're looking for? And then based on that, back out an actual plan. Like, what are we going to do when, in what order? What are we going to prioritize and deprioritize to get there? And that's kind of how you get to your time frame of how much money are we raising and how long does it have to last and what are we going to do? And so 18 months or 24 months later, we can be at this place and have a good chance to raise the round that we need to continue going and then rinse and repeat to your Series B. And so
I like that advice a lot. Right. Basically do your pitch deck, basically do your Series A pitch deck at the C, do your Series B pitch deck at the A. I like that advice a lot. It's also almost visualizing, what do I want to be pitching at that moment? What do I want to be pitching? What do I have to do to get to that place?
The analogy in the product world is like write the headline, right?
Yeah.
It's like write the press release of, when you ship this product, like what you're going to say about it, or when you've, had success with this product, like what are the things you're going to brag about, what's going to be important, and work your way backwards to the product plan, from there. It's kind of the same thing. It's like, envision and clarify the goal of where you need to get to it. And let's be clear, when you're venture backed and losing money, like that's your only goal is to get to the next round and keep going. And so, and then it became really easy to figure out what to do in what order in order to get there.
I have founders that I talk to and they tell me, I pitched 20 people and I got all these no's and like, I guess that's it. And I'm like, the number 60. I talked to someone the other day for an interview, it was 80. I talked to someone was 90. Like,
I mean, let's be clear. Our Series D, I pitched, I think 40 firms and had basically given up. And then the last one, I mean, it's always the last one, right? I mean, but like you only won. So number 41, we were connected with, and thank God they were fantastic. Riverwood's been an incredible investor now for 8 years. But
it's like getting married, kind of. Sometimes, it's like finding the person who sees the value in what you're doing, believes in that vision, aligns with and there are so many thousands of investors in the world. Like that one for you exists, but it may take 100 meetings to find that one.
That's right. And again, like every, listen, handful of businesses in a generation are going to have this magical thing where everybody wants to invest in there. If you're Facebook, great. Don't listen to my podcast. You don't need my advice. For most of us, even very successful startups, like that's just not your reality. And, your business has issues, your business has problems, and those translate into risks and questions on the other side. And not everyone's going to get comfortable with those risks. And not everyone's going to have good answers to those questions. And it may not even be you. It may be like, well, the person that you pitched doesn't have the right political clout today, as they did a deal last year that went south. And so when they show up at the Monday meeting with their deal memo, the partner rolls their eyes. Like, it's nothing to do with you, or like, oh man, I invested in some HR tech company 8 years ago and it stunk. I'm not going to do that again. Like, okay, that's not my problem. And so there's an umpteen million reasons why any given investor isn't going to invest in you. And a lot of them have nothing to do with you. So in a lot of ways, it is just a numbers game. And I think one of the problems, I mean, obviously there's just like how do you keep going? And it's like hard just to have the optimism and the wherewithal, but assuming that, one of the problems is, you try to make adjustments after every time. Oh, if I didn't do it right, it's because of this. I'm going to change my deck. I'm going to reorient my pitch. I'm going to try to get a little further or whatever. And like, there's an art there to knowing when is it not the pitch, and just like keep throwing your pitch. And now it's just about, finding the right person to connect with it. And what I found was at some point, the less you like, if you stop changing your pitch after some point, now you've got to figure it out and you kind of know when that is, then you actually get better at delivering it. And so just keep delivering it over and over again until you find that. And so I always think when I was going into a venture round, like at the beginning, you aren't that confident in your pitch because you haven't delivered it a lot and you don't know what's going to land and you're going to get a bunch of questions. But after you've done it, even like 4 or 5 times, you're like, okay, everyone's going to ask the same question and they're going to have this thing. You tweak those bits in the pitch. And then it's just about, okay, now I just got to get in there and just like blast through the phone book and get to the right person.
So you were building in New York early. I mean, like I said in the intro, early.
Early.
And there were not a lot of investors. It was early. How would you describe those early days? Like, what was the ecosystem like? What was it like to build here? And why did you choose to build here?
Well, ecosystem is putting it a little bit grandiosely for what it felt like. So to set the stage, it was 1997 when I started my first business in New York. I had quit my job as a programmer. I had an opportunity, very fortunately, with a guy that I had gone to engineering school with, to take on a project at a big bank. And based on that assignment, we quit our jobs, started a business and hung a shingle. At the time, there was no free software. There was no, like, the development tools alone to build software cost thousands of dollars. I mean, you could buy like the Microsoft development suite was like $999 for the entry version. There was no cloud. You had to like buy hardware and stick it in a room and air condition it and plug in phone lines, to do things like store files. I mean, I'm just like stuff that you take for granted now. And then when you built software, you had to like burn it on CDs and drive it to your customer in a taxi. And so there was a huge amount of friction and a huge amount of overhead required just to get anything started and shipped. There were a handful of businesses, like a dozen. in mostly lower Manhattan, where the phone companies and the electronic stock market exchanges had been, where there was connectivity, literal physical wires that went out into New York Harbor, like connected to the internet. And like, if you signed a long-term lease in one of those buildings with this wired for internet program, it meant that in 6 months or less, you'd get ISDN lines into your space, which was great.
6 months.
Yeah, 6 months. So there wasn't a whole lot, I guess I would say. There was, I like to joke it was, it was DoubleClick and it was Time Magazine's website. That was the internet industry in New York, in the late 90s. And there were people doing, there was like this group called Cyber Suds. Everything was cyber back in the 90s. It was Cyber Suds, which was like the get together where like the few dozen of us that were doing some kind of technology or interactive media, as they called it, businesses would get together over a beer and talk shop. But there were no investors. You couldn't go on like SaaStr and just read about how to do all this stuff. There was no know-how. And there were certainly no investors. So, I mean, partly that's why my first business didn't work. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, mostly because I was dumb and didn't know what I was doing. I was 23 years old and I didn't have any money, but ultimately, all the support concepts, all the podcasts and all the Reddit threads and all the stuff that you can learn now wasn't there. And so you just had to make each mistake on your own, and they're all very expensive.
What do you think about the New York ecosystem today?
Yeah. If you asked me then to picture what it's become now, I would not have believed it, even when we started Greenhouse. So now fast forward from 1997, to my next business, which we grew up in New York and I sold in the late 2000s, and we started Greenhouse in 2012. Even then, the idea that you could start a big successful software business in New York was not at all accepted wisdom. In fact, I remember going to SaaStr conference in California, where I never really spent any time in San Francisco. I didn't know what it was all about. I was a New York guy, but I was on stage at SaaStr in, I want to say 2012 or 13. And someone asked me the question from the audience. They said, do you think you can build a successful business in New York City? Like it's never been done before. And I just thought that was the weirdest question. I remember kind of like, what are you talking about? And I said, like on stage, I was like, there's a huge city there. There's skyscrapers and millions of people. Like it's the whole thing. You should check it out. And people kind of chuckled. But the point I made was like, I think there was a very narrow concept of what the ingredients for success were. It's like, well, have you been in Silicon Valley? Have you been in a big software, company before? These things, we didn't call it SaaS at the time, but, and I thought like, man, there's a ton of talented people in New York, that have done all kinds of things, that have sold and that have built lots of complicated software, and I'd done a lot of that. And I don't need that many of them, I mean, in the scheme of things, it's a city of, 8 million people. I need like 2 programmers to start this company, and beyond my wildest dreams, I'd have 100 employees. It just didn't seem like that big of a barrier. But yeah, like the capital wasn't here. There were some investors then, and I met with most of them. None of them invested. So I'd kind of go out to California where there was a lot more optimism and a lot more, idealism about the growth possibilities, and I'd raise money. And then I'd come back here and build a company.
I had an investor tell me one time when I was fundraising for Better Cloud in the early days, he said, I'll give you a term sheet as long as you move you and your whole team to California, because I don't know how you're going to build this company in New York, And it's like,
well, I mean, look, I think if I'm wrong, but I think the first time we met was at a Workbench event.
Yeah. It was,
right?
Yeah.
You don't know how, maybe a decade or more ago, but, that's, to me, that's emblematic, because Workbench was like incubated by like R.R. Donnelley, like financial printer company. They printed like those prospectuses you get in the mail when you like buy a share of stock. And they're like, oh, like maybe this software thing is worth something. Let's like rent out a little office and put a couple of folks in and see what happens. And it's like, no, that's like huge. And so they've been, there's these now like institutions, like I said, there's so many communities of tech startups here. The New York tech meetup became a huge driver of the culture. Companies like Foursquare, were very, things like that. So over the last, it's unimaginable. But when we started Greenhouse, like none of that was here. To see what's come of the New York tech ecosystem, I think particularly the New York B2B tech ecosystem, and even more particularly the New York HR tech ecosystem, has really become quite a force. and it's great. I mean, I'm really thrilled about it.
Awesome. So last question here. What is the biggest challenge you've ever faced at Greenhouse, and how have you overcome that challenge?
I only get one. I mean, it's just, that's there's a lot. I mean, when you ask that question, I got to think about COVID because, in 2020, we had been on a real growth tear. The business was growing, like rapidly. And then all of a sudden everything changed. We didn't see it. Nobody knew what was coming. In fact, we tried working from home. We said, there's all this talk of like in office may not be a thing. So like, we're going to try out working from home on a Thursday. We're going to do it for a couple of days. We'll work out some of the bugs. No pun intended. And then, if and when we do have to go work from home, like we'll have already done it. Well, we never came back. We went home on a Thursday. And before that weekend was up, we told people not to come back to the office, and we never went back to the office. So then a few weeks later, there were 13 million unemployed in the jobs report in 1 week. To give some context, a typical unemployment or typical jobs report has a swing of maybe a few 100,000 plus or minus. 13 million unemployed in one go. As a person selling hiring software, that's an extinction event. And we're thinking like, are we done? Are we ever going to sell software again? Are any of our customers even going to be around to renew? Meanwhile, I had moved out of the city with my wife and our, at the time, 8-year-old into my in-laws. I was living in the childhood bedroom of my brother-in-law, my brother, running the company, on a fold-out chair in a bedroom. And then these like PPP loans came out, and there was all this debate, like, should we take it? Should we not? Do we, everybody needed the money, but it was like, is it risky? Are we going to get audited? Do we really need the money? Do we want to hire people? We ended up laying off a bunch of people, which turned out to be a mistake. And we tried to hire them all back in a few weeks because, as we now know in retrospect, the economy, especially the online economy, really took off, went in hypergrowth. And we grew 30% after that in that same year. And so, yeah, it was just like, from an interpersonal perspective, from a leadership perspective, I mean, those are some of the most challenging and raw conversations I've had with coworkers and colleagues, with investors and board members, with people I would just remember having calls just with strangers or like people I knew through the industry but never met. We would like DM each other on Twitter and then get on a late night phone call, be like, what the hell is going on at your company? How are you dealing with this? And it was brutal. It was grim.
And what has happened now since, have you brought people back into the office? Are you still fully remote?
Yeah, well, like I said, so we never ended up going back into office. What we did see was, so after that initial period in April with the jobs cuts and we did a layoff, and then quickly realized our business going through actual hypergrowth, we started hiring like mad. And because everybody was already working at home, we were hiring people wherever they were, mostly not in New York. And we thought, well, this is great. We can hire people all over the country. We can draw from an incredibly broad talent pool. Where often like Greenhouse might be like a great tech job for them if you're living in Atlanta or Minneapolis, where there may not be a ton of SaaS companies in your zip code. And so we grew the business now, multiples over the next, 18 or 24 months. By the time people started even contemplating going back into office and should we do it part-time or 2 days a week or whatever, most of the employees were nowhere near an office that we even had. And yet we had invested a lot in kind of the online culture. So much of what makes Greenhouse happens in Slack and Zoom. And so it's not without its challenges building an online culture and a remote first company. It is, but so is building an in-office company. And so the way I see it is like, I think we've developed kind of almost two separate workforce markets. There's a workforce market for people who want to work in offices and one for people who want to work remotely. And we hire from one of those and not the other. If you want to go into an office 5 days a week and work with colleagues, I don't have that to offer. On the other hand, if you don't want to worry, am I going to have to go to my office one day? If you don't want to have to buy buy or rent housing within a short commute to your office that you can afford. That, oh, by the way, since you're only in the office 3 days a week, you have to have a home office in your expensive New York apartment 2 days a week to work from anyway. And like get childcare that can work around that flexible schedule. All that stuff is really hard. If you don't want to deal with all that, you just want to be in a remote first company where you can do your best work no matter what, we can definitely offer that. And so it's just like
Mm.
a different formula for success with its own rewards and challenges. It's been great for hiring diverse talent. It's been great for things like time zone coverage, um, and for being really flexible with sort of where the work gets done. But yeah, it's been and today we still are remote first.
It's interesting because actually, it became the standard obviously during COVID, and then everyone was hiring remote and everyone was hiring all over the country. Now, actually, I would say now it's becoming a competitive advantage probably for hiring because as everyone's going back to the office, you have, to your point, at least that population, if there's those two cohort, that
You got it.
population.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we connect to the people that that want that, and so I think it gives us an advantage for those folks, and even like I talk to either candidates or employees, and at other workplaces where you're allowed to work from home, but everyone doesn't do it. It's hard. You're the person on Zoom, and everybody else is sitting on a conference room. Like it's hard to be the equal participant there. Whereas in Greenhouse, everybody's another box on the same Zoom. Everyone's kind of participating in equal ways. And then when we get together in person, like I said, I was at an offsite a couple of weeks ago with our 300 of our employees. Like, yeah, we all get together, pretty regularly, and do the things we need to do in person.
So fast forward 3 years, it's 2028. What does Greenhouse look like in 2028? What are you most excited about for the next 3 years?
Boy, a ton of stuff. I would say anytime I think about the future and the vision, I keep going back to our mission of helping every company in the world become great at hiring. And why do I say that in answer to your question? Because while I'm thrilled that we've got the thousands of customers we have, there's millions of businesses to hire. And so as I look out in the future, I think like,
Mm.
okay, who are those next businesses that we need to connect with, and what do we need to do to get there? Whether it's companies that are like larger than our current customers, companies in different industries, even companies in different parts of the world where we don't yet work with them. And so, and one part of your answer to your question is I think our customer base is larger, more diversified in different industries, more global. The other though is kind of in some ways more interesting is like, yeah, like if you're going to try to make them all great at hiring, I don't think we've done that fully yet. I think a lot of our customers have really made some improvements. Great. I'm super proud of all that. Our customers make hires faster and cheaper. They build more diverse teams. They're more inclusive. They give great candidate experiences. All that is true. And yet, every single one of them has giant opportunities to do better. And so I think we're more deeply solving more valuable hiring problems all up and down the hiring stack. I think the way our customers find candidates and connect with talent, the way they move people through the process, the way they make choices and assess candidates and talent, and even like the way they make offers and hire people and onboard them, like all of that is tremendous room for improvement, more so with AI than ever before. And so there's a ton of ways in which a lot of those problems, I think we're going to make a ton of headway over the next few years. And so I think even just like the fundamental relationship between how Greenhouse, how you work with a software product is just changing so much with the conversational and agent-based AI interfaces that I think the whole idea of like what even the product looks like will be radically different.
So quick transition to your background. And you mentioned third company, Greenhouse third company, and you talked about starting that first company when you got that big project. Did you always know you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
I did. I was always entrepreneurial as a kid. I was very fortunate. First of all, I come from a line of entrepreneurs. My mom was an entrepreneur. She started a business at our kitchen table when I was 7 years old, maybe.
Doing what?
Um, doing corporate relocation services. So it's like a little bit obscure sounding maybe, but if you picture where I grew up in suburban Detroit, there were like a lot of big auto companies and they would relocate teams and even executives from city to city, even country to country. And so when you're moving 50 executives from Germany to Detroit, each one of them needs a tour of the area, some advice about where to live and where to send your kids to school, what church you should join, all of it. Now, today, maybe that's a lot of that is online, but back then you were taking a map from AAA, you were putting little stickers on it to show different apartment buildings and driving them around to show him stuff. So that was like a big service. So she started that business really helping a friend who was moving to town, ended up being the biggest provider of these services in the world. And so and
In the
grew the
world?
business. It was a big business and successful entrepreneur. So, and I was as a teenager, like me and all my friends worked at my mom's company. So obviously that was like, I feel super fortunate to have had that opportunity. Not everybody does, but it exposed me early on to the kinds of day-to-day problems that occur in an office and in a workplace that can be solved with technology. And so even just like the opportunity to take a lot of the manual work of like producing these packets for clients, I saw like when I was 15 or 16 years old, word processing was new. And I started building macros to like take something that had been like a few hours of work and make a button that you could push and produce the packet. Like I did that when I was a kid, when I was in high school. So, and I loved it. I was like, oh, great. So like, I don't know the first thing about a consumer, I don't know anything about fashion, or whatever, like, but B2B, like solving business problems, like I connected with early on. So I always knew I wanted to do that. Um, and even like in college, I was like over summer vacations, I was like building database products for school districts I knew, or for like businesses that I found and stuff. So that was just like that was in my bones for a long time.
Wow. Literally from like
It
having the
was like,
youngest age.
I still love it. I mean, the fact is like, um, to me, the idea that, you can sit there now, I don't get to do it anymore hands on, but nonetheless, I have a role to play. Like the fact that you can sit there and just conjure something in your mind, put a little bit of effort into getting it down into code, and then you can step away from it. Other people can like use it, and day to day, they're satisfied. Their jobs are easier. Their businesses are better. Like such a satisfying, creative feeling for me, which I know most people would say HR software is not creative, but I think if you're to me, like, and I think a lot of folks that do what we do, that idea of just like helping solve a sticky business problem that no one else has figured out how to do, and you have, incredibly satisfying.
So you and I have talked, we met, we had dinner one time for one of the, I think that Cloud NY event. We were sitting next to each other at the dinner, and you're a little bit ahead of me, I think, with my kids, with your kid, and, how have you balanced that? You
Yeah.
in the early days was the early days of kind of
Yes.
your
Yeah.
growing family. Like, how did you deal with that?
Well, it's hard. I mean, there's no easy solution. I like to joke like, the balancing, the formula that you need to follow is, you can about eat right, exercise, get lots of sleep, spend time with your spouse, spend time with your kid, be involved in their school, be really dedicated leader at work. Pick one. It's like pick maybe one and a half. Like you're just gonna have to like prioritize and make some choices, and you're not gonna be able to be everywhere all at once. It's true. The other is I am very fortunate. I have I have the resources to be able to like get some help with, childcare and things like that that not everybody has. So that's a part of how I was able to solve some of those issues too. Um, Look, I think early on, when it was literally just John and I, my co-founder John and I, in my apartment. I had a newborn and I had a brand new business. Like he didn't have like I could say at the inception stage, like everyone has problems in their business, but the inception stage, your problems are all fun. So we had fun problems. I didn't have operational problems. I didn't have any customers. I didn't have any employees. I didn't have any investors. Now those were my problems that I didn't have those things. But it's just you can sit there and you can feed the baby and put him down for a nap and then go back into the living room and bang out another few pages on the deck or send out some emails. And so I balanced in the early days doing that. But yeah, there was always a permeable barrier, I think, between home and work for me. I remember in people that have been here at Greenhouse for 10, 11, 12 years, like they'll tell you, seeing the stroller in the office. Later seeing me dial in and we talked about COVID, like seeing me,
Yeah.
that same year, I had a break every afternoon at 2 o'clock to have a pillow fight with my kid. I mean, that was what I did. An 8-year-old and, 2 o'clock to 2:15, we had a pillow fight, and then I'd get back on Zoom. So you just, you just have to recognize that, everyone's only got 24 hours in every single day. And so, you got to make it work.
Yeah, the sacrifices, I think the sacrifices are, and I don't know, you talk about the having people see that. I don't know that actually most people in the company see, know that and feel that. It's like a lot of times it's kind of go full circle to what we talked about before of like, you are the CEO, you are, and you looked at it in a different way. And I don't know, I feel that that's something that maybe you were better about kind of showing that to the company. But I just think it's important because a lot of people, first time founder, starting a family, and they feel like those 7 things that you mentioned before, they have to do all of them, when in reality it's literally impossible. Like it's
Yeah.
not even,
It
it's
just
literally
doesn't,
impossible.
it doesn't math, right? Well, that's why I kind of, that's why I take care to say like, well, I was fortunate that I was able to hire a great nanny early on and take a lot of the childcare responsibilities. I should mention my wife's also an entrepreneur, very successful. And so, she wasn't sitting at home, changing diapers either. Um, and so like when you're looking and you're going like, geez, like how do other people do it? I don't, it's like, well, that's how. And
Right,
so,
right,
it's just
exactly.
it's just a reality. And so I just like to be honest about that because I think it's, sometimes you hear stories in the press or people, try to make it seem that they're superhuman, like, oh, that person seems to get it all done. What's wrong with me? It's like, nothing's wrong with you. It's like, doesn't all fit into one box. You got to have other ways to solve those issues. And, look, you said the word sacrifice earlier. I would say it's slightly different. I mean, I mean, I think I've made choices and, you had to prioritize some things over others, but I feel a tremendous amount of, fortune for the opportunity to do that.
Mm.
And, there's a lot, you sometimes hear people, oh, like nobody realizes how hard it is to be a CEO. Like, get over yourself. Come on. It's a hard job to go break rocks for 12 hours a day. Go work at a McDonald's. Like, that's a hard job. This is a tremendous privilege.
Knowing everything you know today, through all this experience you've had, what is the one piece of advice you would go back and give yourself before you started your first job ever?
I think for me, I'll say 2 things if I could. All right. One is I think is really decide what matters most and like what and why for you. It's different for everyone. And, a lot of people I see that are starting out or that are, new entrepreneurs, they get caught up in a lot of the stuff that you hear, whether it's the, get to raise venture capital, that's really a big milestone. I want to go public one day, that's a big milestone, or I want to be on the cover of Time magazine or whatever it is that's your thing. Like, if that's really your thing, great. But it's those things don't always happen. And for me, one of the early lessons that took me a bit to learn, but once I figured out was a real unlock was like, okay, here's what I actually care about. I want to work on a mission, on solving a problem that's meaningful, right? And I want to work on a great team. That's my thing. And by choosing the path I've chosen, there's a lot else I throw to the wind, right? It's risky. It doesn't always work out. You may or may not make money. All the problems we just talked about balancing a lot, those are all there. But I can guarantee you, I get to work on an interesting mission because I set the mission, and I get to work on a great team because I hire the people. And so, like, once I knew why I was doing this thing, it made it a lot easier to stay committed to it because there's no other path I have where the things that are most important to me at work I can get than what I'm doing. And so that was a real insight. I think the second thing I'll say is just that as we started to grow and scale, some of the stuff we talked about earlier, that was hard to learn of like, how do you really make space for other people? How do you really listen and get the benefit of their perspectives? That's not easy. And, I think I could have done a better job earlier on, if I had that advice of just being better at listening and just being a better, being more empathetic to other folks.
Daniel, I really appreciate this. I think you've said a couple of times how the stories that are out there are, you know, over, celebrate, dramatize. I don't know,
Yes.
and I couldn't agree more. It literally, this conversation is like, this is why I started this podcast, is to have conversations like this. Cause I think this is actually what people need to hear when they're going through the journey. Cause this is real. Everything you've shared is like this. There isn't a answer to this thing. There isn't, it's not all perfect. It's not all easy. It's not all up and to the right every day. So I really appreciate this. Thank you for doing this with me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Always great to catch up with you. And, looking forward to seeing you again around in the future.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. And thank you everyone to listen for listening. And Hope you enjoyed this. Please share it with your networks, and we'll see you for the next episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. That's a wrap for this week's episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. Thanks for joining. For show notes and more, please visit notanotherceopodcast.com. We'll see you next week.